It happens in every single specialized skill, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
You run into these long-standing rules, this kind of institutional wisdom that just gets repeated and repeated, but often without any real scientific proof behind it.
Exactly. They're heuristics, shortcuts. And they get passed down because, well, they're easy to teach and they're simple to remember.
Right.
But the problem is sometimes those shortcuts, they actually hide what's really going on. They obscure the mechanical, the physiological, the neurological complexity of what you're actually trying to do.
And today we are doing a deep dive into one of the most fundamental, most frequently taught, and according to the science we've been looking at, maybe one of the least substantiated rules in all of modern firearms instruction.
We're talking about trigger control in semi-automatic pistols.
Yep. If you've ever taken a class, read a manual, watched a YouTube video, you've heard it. You've heard that that mandatory rule. Use only the distal pad of your index finger.
And that single, simple directive is what the integrated body of science we've looked at today just completely challenges. I mean, this isn't about questioning a minor little technique point.
Yeah.
We are questioning the very foundation of an instructional dogma. The actual task, trigger manipulation, if you define it biomechanically, it's just the controlled, continuous application of force by your index finger digit 2 to activate the sear.
And the really crucial part of that is the constraint.
Yeah.
Right? You have to do that incredibly precise movement while also minimizing any other movement of the firearm itself. No displacement, no vibration.
It sounds so deceptively simple. Just press the trigger straight back.
Ah.
But our sources define the coordination needed as highly sophisticated. It's selective digit articulation.
So bending specific joints.
Exactly. Bending specific joints combined with this intense isometric stabilization across your entire hand, your wrist, and your forearm. You're basically asking your brain to do two very difficult things at once. Move one tiny part with precision and hold everything else perfectly still.
A feat of independence and stability. And traditional instruction has what pretty much ignored all that sophistication.
Completely. The sources argue, and I think really compellingly, that historical firearms education has just reduced this whole complex process down to these simplistic heuristics.
Like the pad-only rule.
Like the pad-only mandate. And this approach, they conclude, is just flawed. It treats the human body like it's a standardized machine and the firearm like it's just an on-off switch. It totally neglects three critical things: anatomical diversity, neuromuscular constraints, and the actual physics of force transfer.
So it's scientifically incomplete.
Scientifically incomplete and, to be frank, pedagogically deficient. Educationally deficient.
Okay, so the mission for this deep dive then, for you
Yeah.
listening, is to move beyond that old doctrine. We're going to be reframing the action of pulling a trigger. It is not a static positioning rule you have to memorize.
No, it's a precision neuromuscular task that you execute dynamically.
That phrase, I think that's the whole thesis right there, a precision neuromuscular task.
It really is. And to understand why the old rule fails and how we can fix it, our sources pull from 5 different scientific fields: functional anatomy, biomechanics, neurophysiology, motor learning science, and, of course, applied physics.
We have to understand the finger, the force, and the brain.
The whole system.
All right, let's unpack this scientific reframing. We're going to explore the 3 scientific pillars that really tear down that old rule and build up a new, individualized approach. First, we're going to get into the anatomy and biomechanics of the finger and ask why where we touch the trigger is. Well, it's inherently variable.
Then we'll dive into the physics of force. We're talking moment arms and collinear vectors.
And finally, we'll explore the critical role of neuromotor control, specifically focusing on velocity and this idea of minimal assumptive force. Okay, let's start at the beginning. The hardware, the human hand. The foundational issue our sources bring up has this powerful title, The Fallacy of Pad-Only Trigger Finger Placement. So if decades of instructors have been mandating using the distal pad, why is that now considered a critical biomechanical mistake?
It's a mistake because it's built on a totally false premise.
Which is?
The assumption of standardized human anatomy. That we're all built the same. Pad-centric instruction assumes this uniform hand morphology. You know, a specific palm length, a specific finger length, specific joint mobility. That just doesn't exist in the real world.
Not at all.
Not at all. So trying to impose a universal placement rule is, and the sources state this very clearly, biomechanically indefensible. It might work for some people by chance, but for many others, it actively harms their ability to be precise.
Indefensible is a very strong word. That's a direct challenge to the status quo. So let's get specific. What are the key anatomical variables that make a universal rule like that impossible to defend?
Oh, there are a ton, and they all interact with the firearm itself. The first and, the most obvious one is just dimensional differences, variations in metacarpal length and phalangeal ratios.
So, the length of the bones in your hand versus the bones in your fingers.
Exactly. Just picture two different shooters. One had a wide, shallow palm with shorter fingers. The other has a narrow, deep palm with really long, slender fingers.
And they could be holding the exact same pistol, but their relationship to that trigger face is going to be completely different.
Totally different. Now add to that the crucial difference in palm depth. A deeper palm forces your finger to wrap further around the grip just to get to the trigger. A shallow palm means your finger is already way forward. And this whole thing gets amplified by the firearm itself, by the trigger reach.
Right.
So if you have someone with very long fingers shooting a little compact pistol with a short reach, forcing them to use only the pad, well, that's often going to lead to a severe overinsertion of the finger.
And the opposite, right? Someone with short fingers trying to shoot a big, full-size competition gun might just barely be able to reach the trigger with the very tip of their finger, which that creates its own set of stability problems.
Correct. And the last layer here of anatomical variability is joint mobility and tendon excursion capacity.
Meaning how far your joints can bend.
Yeah. Some people's joints just don't flex or extend as much as others. So if you force a shooter into a specific position, their own anatomy might force them to, say, hyperextended joint just to get that pad-only contact.
And that stress immediately introduces tension and tremor.
Of course.
So if I've got long fingers and I'm forced to curl them way back to hit the trigger with just the pad, my whole hand is probably cramped up. And that cramped posture is fighting against that isometric stabilization we were talking about earlier.
Precisely. Which leads us right to the functional anatomy of the index finger itself, digit 2. It's specialized. The sources really emphasize its high degree of neuromuscular independence compared to the other fingers.
Its neighbors, digits 3, 4, and V.
Right. And this independence, it's not an accident. It's because of its specialized and relatively large representation in the brain, the cortex. The brain dedicates a lot of refined processing power specifically to digit 2. It allows for incredibly minute control.
It's the precision tool of the hand.
Yeah.
It's designed for things like picking up a tiny screw or, in this case, manipulating a light lever.
Yeah.
So which specific muscles are we actually using when we do that bending motion, the flexion?
Well, we have to know the muscle groups because this is where the air actually comes from. The key muscles for strong, controlled flexion are the flexor digitorum profundus, or FDP, and the flexor digitorum superficialis, or FDS.
Okay.
These are the big movers. They're actually located up in your forearm, which gives them a huge mechanical advantage. Then you've got the smaller muscles in the hand itself, like the lumbricals and the interossei. They mostly just refine the movement and stabilize the joints closer to the hand.
So the FDP and FDS are the engine. They're pulling the finger back.
Yeah.
And since any movement needs stability, where does the braking force, the antagonist, come from?
That antagonist stabilization mainly comes from the extensor digitorum. It's constantly working to modulate the movement to make sure the flexion is smooth and controlled and not just a sudden jerk. It's a really complex synergy. The FDP-FDS flex, the extensors modulate, and the little hand muscles hold the whole system steady.
Okay, so let's contrast the desired articulation with the undesired one. If we want a stable, deliberate pull, where should the finger ideally be bending?
Optimal manipulation, it uses the power of those big forearm muscles. And it happens through controlled flexion primarily at two joints. The metacarpophalangeal joint, the MCP,
The big knuckle.
your big knuckle where the finger meets the hand, and the proximal interphalangeal joint, the PIP, which is the first bend in your finger. Bending at these points uses the long lever of the finger and those big, powerful muscles for stability.
And what happens when people rigidly follow that pad-only rule and they try to press the trigger without really engaging those two powerful joints?
That results in what the source calls DIP dominant articulation. DIP stands for the distal interphalangeal joint.
The one right at the fingertip.
The one at the fingertip. When you try to flex only that joint, you're forced to rely on the smaller, weaker muscles in your hand, not the robust FDP and FDS. And that reliance immediately degrades your precision, it degrades your stability, and it often results in this twitchy, inconsistent force.
Okay, I get that the muscles are weaker, but how does that mechanical failure actually show up for the shooter on the target?
It shows up in two critical ways. First, that DIP dominant movement, it massively increases lateral shear forces. You're basically introducing off-axis force because the fingertip itself is a very unstable axis of rotation.
Sure.
But the second thing, and this is the really disruptive one, is that it promotes sympathetic contraction.
Ah, the involuntary muscle squeeze.
Yes, this is your brain basically saying, hey, I can't do this fine motor task with just the tip of digit 2, so I'm going to activate the neighbor's digits 3rd, 4, and V to help out and provide some general stability.
And that unwanted help causes the entire grip to clench or shift.
Right as the shot is about to break.
So the shooter, who is trying so hard to be precise by isolating the very tip of their finger, is, paradoxically, making their entire firing platform unstable. It's this internal neurological trade-off that physically moves the gun.
Yeah, think about it like this. Imagine trying to squeeze the very last bit of toothpaste out of a tube using only your fingertips.
Right.
To get that last bit, you'd unconsciously start using your ring and pinky fingers to stabilize the tube and generate enough force. That lateral clenching, when you apply it to the grip of a pistol, it shifts your alignment. It's a direct anatomical and neurophysiological argument against a universal pad-only rule. For a lot of shooters, using the PIP joint, the first knuckle provides a much more stable lever. It lets the stronger FDP and FDS generate a powerful straight-line force with minimal sympathetic clenching.
Okay, so we've established the hand is this variable, complex biomechanical machine, and that a pad-only placement can actually induce these unwanted internal forces through muscle synergy. So now let's shift from what the finger's doing internally to what that force is doing externally to the gun. And this is where it gets really, really interesting because traditional instruction is obsessed with where the skin touches the trigger.
But the science says that's completely secondary to how the force is directed.
Exactly.
Yeah, the mechanical analysis here is crystal clear, and it really forms the central pillar of this new doctrine. The core principle is this. Linear force direction, not the location of skin contact, is the primary determinant of trigger stability.
The physical goal is to achieve straight-line trigger kinematics.
A purely posterior force application. You want the line of effort running perfectly parallel to the barrel of the gun.
So if I can apply that force perfectly straight back, does that mean the contact point could be the pad, the joint, or even the middle of my finger, and it wouldn't matter?
That is the ultimate conclusion you get from a rigid mechanical analysis. Yes. Linear kinematics will minimize any off-axis torque at the trigger, regardless of where your finger is touching it. The problem, as we just talked about, is that certain placement choices make it much, much harder to actually achieve that linear force vector because of our anatomical constraints.
Okay, so let's get into the detail of why pad-centric contact is so often mechanically bad for you, why it leads to nonlinear force. And this is where we get into the concept of the moment arm.
This is pure applied physics. When you use only the distal pad of your finger, you are significantly increasing the moment arm. And the moment arm is just the perpendicular distance between where you apply the force, the trigger face, and the finger's main axis of rotation, which is primarily your big knuckle, the MCP joint.
And what happens when you make that perpendicular distance, that moment arm, longer?
You dramatically amplify any tiny lateral error in your pull. You increase that moment arm, you amplify the twisting force. So even a tiny subconscious little wiggle off that straight back line gets magnified into a large lateral force on the frame of the pistol.
So if my trigger pull is, let's say, 6 pounds, but I have a long moment arm because of my finger placement, a tiny half-pound of sideways pressure translates into a much bigger twisting force than if my finger was engaged closer to my knuckle.
Precisely. The best analogy is turning a stubborn lug nut on a car tire.
Okay.
If you use a short, stubby little wrench, you have to apply a ton of concentrated force, and any wobble in your hand goes right into your wrist. But if you use a very long wrench, a long moment arm, you can apply less force overall, but if your shoulder drifts even a tiny bit sideways, that lateral movement gets amplified and the wrench twists right off the bolt.
Ah, I see.
The trigger is exactly the same. That amplification of lateral torque is what induces transverse muzzle displacement, pushing the gun sideways, at the exact moment the shot breaks.
And since that force is applied over the smallest possible area at the most critical moment, that sideways push is exactly what moves the sights off the target.
That's it. Conversely, the sources find that when you articulate primarily through the PIP joint, engaging the trigger a little deeper on the finger, you tend to produce a much more collinear force vector.
More collinear, meaning the line of force is better aligned with the barrel.
Yes. When the finger bends closer to that first joint, it often aligns the lever of the finger more directly along that straight back path. And this is especially helpful for shooters with those anatomical challenges we talked about, like really long fingers on a short reach trigger. For them, a pad-only hold is just inherently prone to creating torque.
So by moving the contact point closer to the pivot, they shorten the moment arm and they minimize the amplification of their errors.
That's right.
Wow. This is a profound shift in focus. We're moving trigger control away from being a static position you have to hold and turning it into a dynamic mechanical interaction based on force vectors.
And that dynamic interaction, it has to acknowledge the mechanical reality of the gun itself. We have to treat trigger manipulation as a staged mechanical process. Modern semi-automatic pistol triggers are sophisticated little machines. They're not just on-off switches.
Let's quickly review those discrete phases that every modern shooter really needs to understand.
Okay. The sources categorize them pretty clearly. Number one is take-up. That's the initial free movement, the slack, before you feel any real resistance.
Got it.
Number two is the resistance wall. That's the point where you hit the main sear spring pressure. This is where you feel most of the pull weight. Then you have the break, which is the moment the sear lets go.
And the gun fires.
The gun fires.
Yeah.
After that is over travel, the little bit of movement the trigger still has before it hits its stop. And finally, reset. The forward movement back to that precise point where the sear re-engages and you can fire the next shot.
So effective manipulation isn't just about the break. It's about consciously managing every single one of those stages.
Absolutely. Motor learning principles teach us that you have to treat these stages as a continuous mechanical interaction, not a binary event. The shooter is basically managing this tiny mechanical journey. If you ignore the stages, you're forced to deal with the full weight of the trigger all at once, which leads directly to those acceleration spikes we're about to talk about.
So how does that mechanical awareness lead to the most efficient technique?
It leads directly to what's called the reset and track methodology. This is all about staged management to minimize the force you need right at that critical moment of the break. First, you do a progressive preload.
Okay.
That means deliberately taking up all the slack, that take-up phase, and staging the trigger right up against the resistance wall before your sights are perfectly settled on the target.
Which makes the critical break phase much, much shorter, both in distance and in time.
Exactly. You've gotten rid of all the irrelevant travel. So once your sight picture is good, you then apply only the minimal incremental force you need to release the sear. Then, after the shot fires, instead of letting your finger fly all the way forward, you execute a controlled decompression just until you feel and hear that click the reset point.
Why is that controlled decompression so much better than just letting the trigger go after the shot?
Because it dramatically reduces the total range of motion your index finger needs to make during rapid fire. By staying right on the reset, your finger might only need to travel a millimeter to re-engage the sear instead of, say, 10 millimeters all the way back through the take-up phase. It massively increases your efficiency and your speed.
So what's the big payoff here? What's the physical outcome of managing the trigger this way? Why should you care?
Well, the outcome is threefold. First, it minimizes acceleration spikes, those sudden, jerky inputs of force. Second, it reduces grip disruption because you're never fighting the full resistance of the trigger abruptly. And third, and this is the most critical part, it preserves your sight alignment, especially during high-speed shooting, because the weapon is disturbed as little as humanly possible during the entire mechanical process. The efficiency comes from staging and controlling the system, not just trying to overpower it.
Okay, so we've covered the anatomy of the finger and the external physics of force transfer. Now we've got to turn inward to the brain. Because even if you understand the anatomy and the physics perfectly, actually executing that straight, smooth, controlled movement under pressure, that requires incredible neuromotor control.
That really is the ultimate bottleneck. The central challenge here is neuromotor isolation. The brain has to command digit 2 to move independently, precisely, and consistently, while the rest of the hand, it has to remain completely still.
But why is isolating digit 2 so hard? It seems like it should be such a simple command.
Because our motor system is built around synergies.
Yeah.
We evolved to use our hands to grip things, to manipulate things, which often involves all the fingers at once. The index finger, even though it's highly independent, is still constrained by shared pathways in the brain. Moving one finger naturally wants to engage the others.
Right.
So to get truly independent movement, your brain needs to perform active inhibition of that synergistic activation in digits 3, 4, and V.
Active inhibition. That sounds exhausting. Like the brain has to simultaneously send 2 commands.
Yeah.
move this finger and do not move these other three fingers. Is that really something you can do under stress?
It is exhausting, especially when you're learning. And that initial struggle is why so many novices fail. But the goal of training isn't to be in a state of constant conscious effort. Eventually, that active inhibition becomes a learned, unconscious habit. But yes, every single time you press the trigger, you are requiring active stabilization of your wrist and hand at the same time you're articulating your finger. You're fighting your hand's natural inclination to just clench under a load.
Your brain is doing this simultaneous go and stop exercise every single time. And that leads us to the two big principles of efficiency here: constant velocity and minimal effective force.
Let's start with the principle of constant velocity. Precision demands that you apply force at a consistent, smooth rate. It has to be a continuous, deliberate increase in pressure over time, not a sudden, rapid stab of force.
And what's the hard science consequence of failing to do that, of jerking the trigger, as we call it?
Abrupt acceleration is just neurologically disruptive. It increases what researchers call neuromuscular noise. This noise is basically an influx of erratic, high-frequency signals in your motor system that destabilize the gun because they transmit these disruptive impulse spikes directly into your grip.
And that spike happens in the critical milliseconds right before the sear breaks.
Exactly. So even if the general direction of your press is perfect, if the speed isn't consistent, that sudden increase in force, that impulse spike, will cause your sights to jump and the bullet leaves slightly off from where you intended.
That makes sense. It's the speed, not just the direction of the force.
Right. It's the number one cause of shot displacement, which usually results in that classic low and left miss for a right-handed shooter.
Okay, so now for the second principle. The principle of minimal effective force, or MEF. This sounds like the complete opposite of just trying to muscle your way through a heavy trigger pull.
It is the absolute pinnacle of efficiency. MEF is defined as using only the absolute minimum pressure required to release the sear. So if your trigger pull is 5 pounds, you should be applying maybe 5.5 pounds of force smoothly and consistently. You should not be applying 12 pounds of force.
Why is that extra force so bad for precision? I mean, if I'm stronger, shouldn't I be able to apply more force and still keep it under control?
The problem is the cascade effect that excess force has on muscle recruitment. Applying double the necessary force means you have to recruit way more muscle fibers, which increases antagonist muscle recruitment, the muscles that are fighting the movement in your finger, your hand, your forearm. And this just rapidly accelerates fatigue.
Which is a huge liability in a long practice session or, a high-stress situation.
Critically. And when you recruit all those extra muscles and generate all that tension, what do you think happens to your fine motor control?
It's gone.
It vanishes. When you tense up and overpress, your capacity for delicate, precise, constant velocity movement just disappears. The smaller intrinsic muscles that are responsible for refinement get completely overridden by the big, clumsy force generators. The shooter just becomes clumsy. And this gets exponentially worse under stress when your body's natural response is already to tense up. MEF is all about optimizing your energy budget.
So the goal isn't maximum effort, it's perfectly optimized, minimal effort. How do we train our brain to actually do this, to synchronize constant velocity and minimal force?
Well, this is the world of motor learning, and the sources really emphasize the critical role of diagnostic drills, specifically dry fire and hybrid drills. These methods are essential because they exploit the two most important feedback loops we have: proprioceptive and visual.
Proprioceptive feedback. That's your body's sense of its own movement, right? Even with your eyes closed. How does dry fire help with that?
Dry fire removes the incredibly disruptive and masking effects of the bang and the recoil. When a shooter dry fires, they're forced to focus entirely on the feel of the trigger mechanics and the sensation of their own movement. They can feel the take-up, the wall, the break, all without that big explosion at the end. It forces the proprioceptive system to pay attention to all those subtle internal cues.
And the visual feedback is just watching the sights.
It's as simple as that. Visual feedback instantly tells your brain whether the force vector was successful. If the sights moved even a tiny bit during the press, the brain gets an immediate error signal. And that tight feedback loop, the instant connection between the movement you feel and the movement you see, that's what drives adaptation.
And what's the ultimate neurological goal of all this feedback and repetition?
The goal is to drive cerebellar adaptation. This is the most sophisticated part of the whole process. The cerebellum, the little brain, is what coordinates and refines all our voluntary movements. Through repetition and correction, the cerebellum starts to take over the motor program.
It's like moving the skill from the slow, conscious part of your brain to the fast, automatic part.
Exactly. It's the difference between learning to ride a bike, where every movement is a struggle, and doing it years later, where you just do it without even thinking about balance or how hard you're pedaling. The cerebellum refines that motor program. It learns to reduce the jerky force, smooth out the velocity, and improve consistency automatically. It trains the system to execute the perfect force and velocity profile without you having to consciously intervene.
And that is the definition of true mastery, when the mechanics become subconscious. Wow. Okay, so the science we've just unpacked is it's remarkably cohesive. We know anatomy demands that we individualize. Physics demands collinear force. Motor control demands constant velocity and minimal effort. So this forces us to ask a really important question that the sources tackle head-on. If the science is this clear, why does pad-centric instruction persist as the default standard?
This is the classic paradox, isn't it? It's institutional inertia crashing into scientific progress. And the sources are, they're unequivocal on this point. The persistence of this outdated instruction is mostly due to systemic inertia and, frankly, educational simplicity.
Not a lack of scientific knowledge.
Not at all. It's just an inherited dogma.
So what are the barriers? What's keeping this outdated doctrine alive?
Well, we can identify three big ones. First is just instructor replication. Most instructors were taught pad only, and without any formal, ongoing scientific education, they just pass on what they were given. Second, certification standards. A lot of law enforcement and professional qualification courses are still using legacy standards that haven't incorporated biomechanics or motor control principles from the last 20 years.
The standards are just slow to change.
Very slow. And the third factor, and maybe the most insidious one, is pedagogical simplicity.
Ease of teaching.
Yeah. A simple rule like use the pad is infinitely easier and faster to explain to a big class of novices than trying to explain moment arms, FDP-FDS muscle recruitment, and cerebellar adaptation. So instructors opt for speed. But the sources deliver a pretty harsh professional judgment here.
Which is?
That pedagogical simplicity that sacrifices precision and biomechanical correctness is just not acceptable. Instruction that ignores anatomy, physics, and motor control isn't just outdated. It is, and this is a quote, educationally deficient. It is failing the learner by giving them rules that are actively counterproductive.
That's a fundamental critique of the entire industry. So if we're moving away from that deficiency, what's the mandatory shift? What do you, the listener, need to look for in a scientifically defensible curriculum?
Well, it represents a huge shift from a one-size-fits-all approach to a kind of radical individualization based on diagnostic analysis. The modern framework is really built on 6 pillars that directly fix the failures of the old doctrine.
Okay, let's break down those pillars. Pillar 1 attacks the universal rule itself.
Right. Reject universal finger placement mandates, period. Technique has to be fully individualized. A good instructor today doesn't dictate use the pad. They teach the goal, which is collinear force, and they help the student find the unique anatomical position on the trigger face that allows them to pull straight back without moving the sights.
So the placement is the result of proper movement, not the rule for it.
Perfectly said. The placement is the result.
Pillars 2 and 3 deal with the mechanics and the physics.
Yes, we have to move the focus entirely. The curriculum must treat trigger control primarily as a joint articulation and force vector problem, not a placement issue. And that means you have to explicitly prioritize achieving linear posterior force application above everything else. Drills should focus on watching the muzzle for any sideways movement, not checking where your skin is touching.
And Pillar 4 connects that motor skill back to the gun itself. This is about staging.
Absolutely vital. Modern instruction has to integrate trigger mechanics and staging awareness. If a student isn't explicitly taught about take-up and the resistance wall, they can't possibly apply the principle of minimal effective force correctly. They have to learn to preload the system.
Pillar 5 is the acknowledgement of human reality.
Yes. It means explicitly accounting for anatomical variability and physical limitations. This requires an instructor to understand the relationship between a student's finger length, their hand size, and the trigger reach of the specific gun they're using. If a student with small hands can't comfortably reach the trigger on a big gun, the modern curriculum says adjust your grip, or, better yet, use a different gun.
We stop blaming the shooter's technique and start blaming the anatomical mismatch.
Exactly. And finally, Pillar 6, the continuous improvement loop.
This sounds like diagnostics.
It is. Employing motor learning-based diagnostics. This means using dry fire, live fire feedback analysis, balance drills, things that give you immediate, unambiguous feedback, like putting a coin on the slide of your pistol during dry fire. If the coin moves, your force vector was flawed. That immediate objective feedback is the engine that drives that cerebellar adaptation we talked about.
And the ultimate check for all of this complexity has to be simple and measurable, right? If my individualized technique is working for me, how does a modern instructor validate it?
The ultimate validation of technique must always be through observable sight behavior. If your technique, using your optimal finger placement, keeps the sights perfectly aligned through the entire process, from staging to the break to the reset, then that technique is correct and scientifically defensible for your unique anatomy. The proof is not in conforming to a diagram in a book.
It's in the results you see through your sights.
That's it.
So after this entire deep dive, what does this all mean for how we define this fundamental skill? We started with a simple press.
And we finish with a scientific synthesis. Trigger control is not a simple press. Trigger control is anatomy, constrained by the unique morphology and musculature of your individual hand.
Trigger control is physics, governed by the moment arm, lateral torque, and the absolute need for a perfectly collinear force vector.
And, perhaps most fundamentally, trigger control is motor control, managed by neurological isolation, the pursuit of constant velocity, and the disciplined application of the principle of minimal effective force. Hashtag outro, the necessary correction.
Wow, so we began this deep dive thinking trigger control was this simple inherited rule, use the pad. And we've concluded with a complex, multifaceted scientific challenge that requires this deep, individualized neuromuscular and mechanical understanding. It's a complete journey from a static rule to a holistic, dynamic system.
And that reframing is what the sources call a necessary correction, the evolution towards science-based instruction. It's not really innovation, it's just catching up with what biomechanics and neuroscience have been telling us for decades. That rigid, pad-centric doctrine is a legacy artifact from an era that just lacked the tools to measure force vectors and neurophysiological responses in real time.
It's really empowering knowledge for the listener. It means that if you're struggling with trigger control, the failure is often not your fault. It might be the instruction's fault for ignoring your individual anatomy. You now have the scientific vocabulary to figure out why a certain method isn't working for you and, crucially, how to scientifically adjust it.
That vocabulary gives you control. And since that principle of minimal effective force MEF is so vital for fine motor control under stress, which is a generalized neurological response, not just unique to shooting, let me leave you with a final thought to mull over.
Okay, let's hear that final connection.
Well, just think about how MEF applies outside of firearms. Consider where else in your daily life you might be applying excessive force in a task that actually requires refinement. Are you gripping your steering wheel way too hard in traffic? Are you pressing down on your keyboard or your pen with far more pressure than you need to? Are you tensing your shoulders when you're doing detailed work like drawing or soldering? The tendency to over-muscle a precision task is a fundamental human failing.
Yeah, that's true.
So if you apply that MEF principle, just enough pressure, no more, to those other tasks, how might optimizing your effort improve your long-term performance, reduce your fatigue, and increase your consistency across all of your fine motor skills? That is the true broad power of understanding motor control.